Trying to figure out the perfect mix between RSPs and TFSAs can feel a bit tricky sometimes because it totally depends on the situation. For instance, what if you have a really high income and therefore you're in really high tax brackets? Or what if you have a lower income and you're in lower tax brackets? Or what if you already have a huge RSP but hardly anything in your TFSA? Well, worry not, because today, these are exactly the kinds of eggs we're going to crack. My name is Reese. I'm the founder of Well Built Wealth, and helping people find the smartest place to stuff money is something that we deal with every day. And since RSPs and TFSAs are two of the most fundamental accounts in Canada, understanding how they work and when to use which is absolute bedrock. And there is no cookie cutter solution because everyone has a different situation. Different tax rates, different amounts of assets, different goals, etc., etc. But as long as you understand a few of the basic details of how these accounts work and the basic details of your situation, then it's fairly easy to find the sweet spot for you. And that's what we're doing today. We'll start with an easy to understand, but possibly life-changing review of the key basics, and then we'll take a look at some of the most common goals and scenarios that people find themselves in and how to decide what that sweet spot might look like in each one of those situations. Now, before we jump into the key facts, I do want to say that there are a lot of different calculators out there that you can use to help you compare the long-term implications of making an RSP or a TFSA contribution. This one here is super easy to use, and I've linked it below in the description if you want to play around with it. However, unless you have hardcore financial planning software like we have, you're not going to get a calculation that actually considers your whole picture and how these contributions affect and are affected by everything else you have going on. For instance, I've yet to see any of these calculators factor in the age credit, the pension credit, or even income splitting. And these kinds of things can really lower the amount of taxes that you'll pay in real life. So basically, a lot of these calculators just don't tell the whole story and can often end up making TFSAs look a whole lot better than they might actually be in real life. The other thing I'll say is that I've already done videos that cover both RRSPs and TFSAs in depth. And if you're new to how these accounts work, I highly recommend you check those videos out. They are very easy to understand, and there is a solid chance you will turn into a finance ninja by the time you're done watching them. If you're already a ninja, feel free to skip the review section, but if you're not, it is very worth your time to stick around. Key fact number 1, a TFSA is not a savings account. Now, since the tax-free savings account literally has savings account in the title, this is a very common and fair mistake to make. But the fact is, while you can have a savings account inside of a TFSA, that's actually only one of your options. You actually have all sorts of options for what you can hold inside of a TFSA. And that brings us to key fact number 2. You can hold the same types of investments in both RRSPs and TFSAs. TFSAs and RRSPs are not actual investments. You cannot invest in an RRSP or a TFSA. They do not have a rate of return. They are simply accounts that you stick your different investments or savings in. And the only reason that you would choose one over the other is because of their different tax features. We'll get into that in a sec. But for now, the important thing to know is that an RSP and a TFSA is identical in terms of what you can hold in them. You can stuff stocks, bonds, ETFs, mutual funds, GICs, savings accounts, etc. inside each of them. Lots of options. But they themselves are not investments. So the next time that you hear someone say that RSPs or TFSAs are bad investments, you will very quickly be able to understand that they have confused the account with the investments that they had in them, which obviously didn't perform all that well for them. It's a very common mistake to make, but one that is very important to recognize because if you don't, it can lead to making really poor decisions. Key fact number 3, TFSAs and RRSPs both have limits. This is very important to know. You cannot just stuff as much money as you want into either of these accounts. There is a cap. And if you go over these limits, you will end up paying a penalty. Now, to keep this video from going too long, all I'll say about how to calculate your limits is that you can find your current limits for each of these accounts by logging into your My CRA account. But again, if you want the full details on RRSP and TFSA limits, you're best to watch the videos I recommended earlier. Key fact number 4. The main difference between a TFSA and an RRSP is taxes. TFSAs give you absolutely no perk up front. The perk for TFSAs is on the back end. You get no tax deductions for what you put into your TFSA, but you do not have to pay any tax on any of the growth that you make while your investments are in a TFSA or when you take them out. So if you let them compound and grow over many years, you get to keep all that growth plus the money you originally put in. Zero tax. RRSPs, on the other hand, have the perk up front, the tax deduction. Simply put, you get a tax deduction for however much money you put into your RRSP for the year. And the higher your tax bracket, the more delicious this tax deduction can be. Now, this is massively important to understand, so I'm just going to spend a sec going over how this works in plain English. But again, if you're already a ninja, feel free to skip ahead. But if not, you will find this super helpful. To help us see this clearly, we're going to look at the income tax rates for 2025 that you would pay at various income levels if you lived in Alberta. But just so you know, I've dropped a link in the description for this page because it has all the combined tax rates for every province and territory in Canada. So no matter where you live, you can easily find out the rates that apply to you. Anyway, back to Alberta. Let's say your income is 100 grand this year. So you'd fit in this row, between 60 and 114 grand. If you look a couple of columns over, you can see the tax rate is 30.5%. Now I'm going to rabbit trail here for just a sec because this is one of the most common misconceptions in Canadian finance. A lot of people mistakenly assume that their top tax bracket applies to all of their income, but it does not. In Canada, you are taxed in layers. It's called a progressive tax system. And it's called that because each level of income you earn is taxed progressively more aggressively. And it can get very aggressive. Let's look at how it works. If you notice here, the first 16 grand someone earns in Alberta in 2025 is taxed at 0%. Nothing. You do not pay a nickel in tax on that first $16,000. The next sliver of income, $16,000 to $22,000, is taxed at 14.5%. But it's only this sliver that is taxed at 14.5%, not all the income. That first 16 grand is still taxed at 0%. So you don't actually have one tax rate in Canada. You usually end up with a bunch. And as you can see, the higher your income goes, the more tax rates you will have. And of course, they get more aggressive as you go. But even when you hit a higher tax bracket like 38%, you have to remember that you're not paying 38% tax on all of your income. You're only paying that rate on this chunk, the income you earn between 151 and 177 grand. The income you earn between 114 and 151 grand is only taxed at 36% because that is a different sliver, and so on. So now that we're all on the same page with that, let's get back to tax deductions. Like I said earlier, any money you put into an RRSP will get you a tax deduction. It will reduce your taxable income for that year. You see, the government considers any money that you contribute to an RRSP as income for later because you're putting it away for later, primarily for retirement. So they don't tax you on it now, they'll tax you on it later when you pull it out. So if you made 100 grand this year and you decided to put $10,000 into your RRSP, the government would see that as you making 90 grand this year, not 100. And that's because that 10 grand you put into your RRSP will be income in some later year, probably retirement. So this year, the government will only tax you on the 90 grand. And since, in this example, the tax rate on that top $10,000 you earned is 30.5%, that's how much tax you'll save this year. 30.5% of $10,000. Your tax deduction is $3,050. It's yours. You can keep it. Now, you'll either get that money back when you file your taxes, or you'll simply owe less tax. It all depends on how much tax you've already paid the government throughout the year. But either way, you will pay $3,050 less in tax this year. And of course, you can take that $3,050 and spend it on anything you like. But if you take that money and reinvest it or use it to help pay down debt, now you're really off to the races. That is how you milk an RRSP. Anyway, these juicy tax deductions are the primary reason that people use an RRSP. This is the upfront perk, but it's not the only perk. The other big one is that you don't have to pay any tax on any of the growth that you make while your investments are in the RRSP, which can really help them compound and grow. Now, TFSAs have that same feature, no tax on the growth. But the big difference is that unlike a TFSA, you do have to pay tax when you pull the money out of the RRSP. And the amount of tax that you have to pay on it when you pull it out has nothing to do with the growth. It just depends on how much other income you have that year. Basically, like we discussed earlier, the more income you have that year, the more tax you will pay. So you want to be very careful about when you pull money out of an RRSP. All right, I realize I just covered a fair amount there. So to summarize the review section, here is a pretty little table that hits the key points in one easy-to-view spot. Feel free to refer back to this anytime you like. Now, of course, there's far more to know about these accounts, but these are the key facts for our purposes today. At its most basic, an RRSP is meant for retirement savings. You put money in now and you get a tax deduction while you're working and are usually in a higher tax bracket. And then you pull it out in retirement when you're usually in a lower tax bracket. And that can usually be a pretty profitable spread. TFSAs, on the other hand, offer no tax deductions, but they do offer total flexibility. You can pull out your money whenever you like with zero tax consequences. You can have it next week, or you can have it in retirement. You can use it for an emergency fund, or you can just never even touch it and let it compound and grow and pass it down as a tax-free inheritance, whatever you like. But in real life, that flexibility can be very, very appealing and can come in very, very handy. In fact, sometimes you just absolutely need access to a large chunk of money. And if it's all stuck behind a tax wall in an RRSP, that can be a serious party pooper, as every cent you pull out will simply be added to your income that year and taxed at your highest tax rates. So in most cases, it is simply wise to build in some flexibility, even if the math doesn't look as sexy. Anyway, now that we understand the basics, let's switch gears a bit and take a look at some of the most common goals and scenarios that people find themselves in, and which account you may want to prioritize in each case. To start, you're going to want to consider your current income and your top tax brackets. If you currently have a low income, and therefore your top tax rates are pretty low, then the tax savings you would get from using an RRSP could be pretty minimal, if not nil. And you might even find yourself in a situation where your income and therefore your tax rates end up higher in retirement than they are now, which means that you could end up paying more tax on the RRSP withdrawals than you saved with the initial low or no tax deduction. And that's pretty much the opposite of what you want. So typically, in years where you have a lower income, you should focus on your TFSA. If you currently have a mid-range income, you should look at both. And this is where a bit of knowledge on tax deductions and your tax rate starts to come in really handy. You may have a portion of your income that is starting to cross over into those more aggressive tax rates. And in those cases, the tax deductions that you could make from making an RRSP contribution can start to look really appealing. For instance, if we look at the combined federal and Alberta income tax rates for 2025 again, we can see that if you earned $65,000, the top $5,000 you earned would be taxed at 30.5%. So if you made a $5,000 RRSP contribution, then you would get 30.5% of that back in a tax deduction. Basically, you'd end up with an extra $1,525 in your jeans. Now let's say that you had 10 grand to save rather than just 5. If you were to contribute all of it to your RRSP, you would now be dropping down into lower tax brackets. In this case, some of it would get you a tax deduction of 28.5%, but some of it would only get you a tax deduction at 22.5%. And 22.5% isn't nearly as juicy as the 30.5% that you got on the first 5 grand. So you may want to consider putting some of that extra money into your TFSA so that you have total flexibility with it. And who knows, in the future, you may find yourself having a higher income. And if so, then now you'll have a stash set aside in your TFSA that you can simply roll over into your RRSP just to take advantage of some extra fat tax deductions. Now, what if you have a high income? Well, obviously, if possible, you're going to want to max out both. But obviously, that's not always possible because you may have other obligations, like kids. Anyway, looking back at our example of the combined federal and Alberta tax rates, you can see that the bigger your income, the more grotesque the tax rates, ending at 48%. And that's Alberta, land of the free. Check out BC, top tax rate of 53.5%. And Ontario, not to be outdone by those Lululemon wearing sushi eating West Coasters, 53.53% top tax rate. Oh yeah. Anyway, it's hard to ignore how delicious the tax deductions can start to get once your tax rates start getting into those levels. Tax savings can be huge. RRSPs are basically standing on a chair screaming at you. Even if you don't want to use them, even if you want the total flexibility of a TFSA, sometimes the tax savings are simply way too heavy to pass up on. And if you do find yourself in this situation with nothing left to go into the TFSA, remember, you might still be able to take that tax refund that you get from making the RRSP contribution and throw that into your TFSA. That is, if you don't end up seeing that money swallowed up in some other direction, like your kids. The next thing you need to consider are the tax rates you are likely to have in retirement. Like we touched on earlier, if you expect your tax rates to be lower in retirement than they are now, then RRSPs can be quite appealing. Remember, the core benefit of an RRSP is getting those juicy tax deductions while you're working and are in high tax brackets, and then pulling the money out when you're retired and are usually in much lower tax brackets. However, it doesn't always work this way. You can sometimes end up in similar or even higher tax brackets in retirement. This can happen if you develop substantial wealth, end up with a lot of retirement income, or simply don't drain down your investments because you continue to work. And of course, there's more ways that this can happen. Regardless, if you're pulling money out of your RSP or a RIF account at higher tax brackets than when you put the money in, that is not ideal. So if you know that that's going to be the case for you, then you may want to pivot and lean into your TFSA. Sure, you won't get those delicious tax deductions, but at this point, you may have so much other taxable income in retirement that the freedom and flexibility that you get with the TFSA simply outweighs all of those considerations. Okay, now that we've considered income and tax bracket scenarios, let's take a look at some more specific situations. Let's start with short-term goals. Pretty much any goals you have that could require a bunch of money at once, especially pre-retirement, you're going to want to use your TFSA. That said, with an RRSP, there is the Home Buyers Plan and the Lifelong Learning Plan, and both of those do have a legitimate place. And we also have the relatively new First Home Savings Account. But aside from that, if you haven't maxed out your TFSA already, then the TFSA is going to be the ticket for down payments, saving up for a car, vacation, emergency fund, rental property, etc., because you can take out however much you want with no tax implications. Now, one important caveat to make is that this video is all about highlighting the appropriate mix between RSPs and TFSAs, and we aren't really getting into non-registered accounts. But non-registered accounts are simply normal taxable accounts. And if you've already maxed out your TFSA room, these are the next best spot for money that you are setting aside for short-term goals. Now, when it comes to long-term goals, both are great. Both RRSPs and TFSAs allow for tax-free compound growth while the funds are in the account, and so both can grow beautifully. The key driver in deciding which one is right is your current and future tax situation, like we discussed earlier. But ideally, use both. A good rule of thumb is to mitigate those top higher tax brackets with RRSP contributions and then use the rest of your excess savings to plug into your TFSA. That said, if your long-term goal is to buy something that will require a large lump sum of money, like a rental property or a cottage or something like that, then don't even consider using an RRSP. Remember, every penny of an RRSP withdrawal is taxed as income in the year you withdraw it. So taking out a huge lump sum all at once that is fully taxable could cause you to curl into a ball in the corner and weep. For instance, if you needed 100 grand, it could mean you end up having to pull out 140 grand to deal with all the taxes and ensure that you end up with the full 100 grand in hand. Now, the exact amount of money that you'd have to pull out to cover all of the tax implications totally depends on the other income that you have throughout that year, but you get the idea. Brutal. Now, what about if you already have an RRSP plan or a pension through your employer? What should you favor then? First of all, it's pretty much always a full-blown genius idea to max out whatever kind of matching retirement plan your employer will give you. It's free money. Do it, as much as they will let you. But if you've already tapped that out, then it may seem intuitive to take whatever extra money you have and plug that into your TFSA since you're already doing the RRSP or pension, which is basically another form of fully taxable retirement income. And maybe the TFSA is the right call. But again, it totally comes down to tax rates and, of course, what you eventually want the money for. If, even after making all the RSP or pension contributions through work, your income is still in those higher tax brackets, then more RRSP contributions could still make a lot of sense. However, if those contributions through work are bringing your income down into the lower tax rates, then the TFSA starts to look pretty darn attractive. Another really common scenario where we see people struggle to find the right mix is when they come into a big chunk of money all at once. Now, this can happen in all sorts of ways, but some of the most common are inheritances, insurance claims, lump sum payouts from an employer, and big dividends from privately held corporations, especially when you're trying to wind down a company. Now, if the lump sum that you're getting is a taxable lump sum, like a payout from your employer or a dividend from your corporation usually is, then that lump sum will be added to your other income for the year, and it will likely push you up into higher and higher tax brackets. So this can cause you to lose a lot of that lump sum to taxes. A lot of it. For example, we regularly see people who already have high incomes and then end up with like a 6-figure plus payout from their employer, which easily pushes them well into that 50-ish% tax bracket. In plain English, they end up in a spot where they will lose half of that lump sum to tax, unless they have enough RRSP room to offset it. Basically, rather than taking the whole lump sum in cash and losing half to tax, they can roll the money into their RRSP instead. Yes, they will have to pay tax on that money later when they withdraw it, but hopefully at a way lower tax rate than 50% since they'll be retired. So yeah, this is basically one of those situations where the RSP is basically screaming at you. It makes so much sense. Even if they don't want to put the money into the RSP, they do it just to avoid that giant tax kick in the head. But what if the lump sum you're getting is tax-free, like inheritances and insurance claims usually are? Well, obviously that's a much more pleasant circumstance. The world is your oyster. In these cases, we usually advise people to look at their whole situation, right? We want to look at their income for the current year. If they're still in some of those high tax brackets, and maybe take some of it and put it into the RSP just to lower them down and get those tax deductions. And for the rest, we generally want to wipe out debt and then max out their tax-free savings accounts. And of course, if there's even more left, that's when we start to look at the non-registered account. The last common scenario I'm going to touch on today is, what are you supposed to do if you already have a massive RRSP? Well, frankly, this is a tough one. And I'm sure you already know that I'm going to say it comes down to your tax rates and what your goals are. And that's true. But usually when someone has a massive RRSP, unless they're young and have lots of years to drain it down at lower tax rates, they are likely going to have to pull out huge amounts of their RRSP/RIF account every year in retirement, which will push them into higher tax brackets. Or leave the bulk of it to keep growing and then have a cosmic tax hit all in 1 year when they or their surviving spouse passes away. So adding more money to the RRSP at this point can simply be adding fuel to the fire. Does it make sense math-wise? Well, it might, but is it worth losing all the flexibility and freedom that you could get if you simply put it into a TFSA? Well, honestly, there is no answer that we love here. We simply play it case by case and year by year. But I can tell you this much. Even when people do choose the RSP in these cases, it isn't with a lot of excitement. And there you have it. You're pretty much a black belt now. But if you're looking for ninja status, then you're going to need to watch these ones too.